I'm avoiding effort. What's wrong with me? Why don't I want to work hard? But it turns out it's not hard work that you're avoiding when you procrastinate. He can predict your job performance and also your likelihood of staying in your job from which web browser you're using. So if I download a better browser, I'm going to be better at my job. No, it's not about the browser. It's about perfectionists do get better grades in school, but they don't actually. Everything that matters in life is always a complex interaction of nature and nurture. Risk takers are more likely to become entrepreneurs, but the most successful entrepreneurs don't. That procrastination only boosted creativity if you.
When you wrote this book and called it Originals, what did you mean by an original? How do you define that?
I think about originals as people who don't just question the way we've always done it, but actually take the initiative to create a better way. So it's not just about having a new idea. It's about taking action to create change. And I think that's so important because I think it's often said that that ideation without execution is just hallucination. There's so many people who dream up interesting ideas but never do anything about them. And actually, I'll give you a personal example. When I was in university, I had a roommate. This is 2000, who had an idea for a social network, and he said, "What if we could build like an online yearbook where everybody had access to each other's profiles and they could communicate and they could plan parties?" And he stayed up all night coding it and actually building the basics of the platform. And then he never followed through and never did anything with it. And, then a few years later, Mark Zuckerberg starts Facebook in the house next door. And I could look at that and say, my roommate was an idiot. Like, why didn't he do anything about it? But guess what? I missed that same opportunity. 1999, I co-founded what was called the first online social network on our campus. And it was an e-group we had connected about an eighth of our entering college freshman class before we got to campus. And we were all exchanging messages and connecting. And then we got to campus and we shut it down because we said, we all live in the same town now. Why do we need an online community? And so I made the same mistake. I was part of a group of people that had a very original idea and we did not execute it.
So the difference is execution there.
I think it's the biggest difference.
And what does it take for someone to be an executioner?
I hope no one becomes an executioner, but maybe an executor would work. I think that it's not what I thought. I think I assumed that you had to be somebody who was always the first mover. That if you didn't act on the social network idea in those first few years, it was going to be too late. But as I think you know this already, Stephen, but I was surprised to find that some of the best originals are actually procrastinators. That they don't rush in. They wait for their best idea as opposed to just immediately implementing their first idea. And of course, they're testing and iterating and experimenting along the way. But let's go back to my Nintendo days here. I've felt like I'm not an original thinker for a long time. And one day I had a PhD student, Jihei Shin, who came to my office and said, I actually think that procrastinating can make you more creative. And Jihei is incredibly creative, and I didn't believe her. I was like, no, this can't be true. And she said, really, I have my most creative ideas when I'm procrastinating. And I didn't believe it because I guess I've always been what psychologists call a precrastinator, which is somebody who the moment you have an idea, you want to immediately put it into practice. And so I was always excited to get things done early, and I was proud of being a good finisher. And Jihei said, I actually think that's a mistake. And I challenged her to test it. And so she went out and studied people in various jobs and had them actually fill out a survey on how often they procrastinate. And then their supervisors rated their creativity. And then we ran some experiments together where we tempted people to procrastinate by putting different numbers of funny YouTube videos available while they were supposed to be doing creative tasks. And then we got their creativity scored by experts. And lo and behold, it turned out that people who procrastinate a little bit are more creative than people who precrastinate like me.
What's your conclusion as to why?
Well, we had a few hunches at first that we tested. The first thing I wanted to know is what happened to the people who always procrastinated. And Jihei was like, I don't know, they never filled out my survey.
Yeah.
No, they did eventually fill out the survey, and they were also less creative. So both extremes were bad. If you never procrastinate, if you always procrastinate, you are less creative than if you sometimes do, or if you do a little. And what we found is there are a couple of mechanisms at play. One is that procrastination can lead you to incubate ideas in the back of your mind. So you have time to connect the dots, see patterns you didn't see before. Another is that you end up getting some distance from the problem, and that allows you to reframe it and look at it from a broader perspective. And so what was interesting in the data, though, was that procrastination only boosted creativity if you were intrinsically motivated by the problem. So if you were putting it off because you were bored or you didn't care, then it didn't stay active in the back of your mind. But if you were putting it off because you were stuck and you hadn't figured it out yet, or you were being patient and you wanted to have 10 or 12 more ideas before you decided which one to pursue, then you actually got a creative boost.
So interesting. And I really relate to it because...
Do you?
Yeah, I 100% relate to it.
Are you a moderate procrastinator?
Yes, 100%. 100%. I think this is important to say because I think sometimes people think that I get a lot of messages from people saying, Steve, I'm procrastinating so much. How do you not procrastinate? And I always look at that and say, look, I'm not the guy to tell you how to do that because procrastination in my mind is a bit of a tool. As you said, there's different types of procrastination that I notice myself doing. One of them is when I get stuck on something and I find myself picking up my phone as if I'm a man possessed. What I'll do is I'll be in the middle of work and then the next thing, I'm on Instagram. And I'm like, how did that happen? Oh, yeah, because the part in this piece of work you got to is psychologically difficult for some reason. I don't feel prepared or whatever. And then the other thing I notice myself procrastinating on is just when I'm thinking through something, I'll end up just walking around the house. I'll end up cleaning, doing the dishes or whatever, and then coming back to the piece of work later. But I would say that I'm definitely a procrastinator.
That's so interesting. And I think, let's be clear. I'm not encouraging people to procrastinate more. That's not the goal here. The goal is just to normalize procrastination and say it's a natural part of the creative process. Everybody does it sometimes. And even though you expect it to be counterproductive, in certain situations, it can actually lead you to better ideas. And I think there's maybe a myth worth busting here. Research led by Fuchsia Sirwa has shown that we don't procrastinate for the reasons we think we do. So a lot of people think I'm being lazy. I'm avoiding effort. What's wrong with me? Why don't I want to work hard? But it turns out it's not hard work that you're avoiding when you procrastinate. It's negative emotions, unpleasant feelings. You are avoiding a set of tasks that makes you feel frustrated, confused, bored, anxious. A lot of procrastination is driven by fear. I don't know if I can do this. I'm not sure if I'm up to the challenge. And so I put it off. And I think one of the best ways to manage that is to ask, what are the tasks that you consistently procrastinate on? What negative emotions are they stirring up? And then how do you change those?
What do you procrastinate on?
I procrastinate a lot on editing, actually, and revising. I love rough drafting. It feels very creative for me. It's fun to figure out, what does the best evidence say? How do I tell the story that brings the evidence to life? And then the process of, tinkering to get each sentence just right, it bores me. And so I put it off. And I had to figure out, how do I make that more interesting in order to stop procrastinating altogether on it.
And how did you do that?
Well, one of the things I did was one of my goals in my recent writing was to try to get less abstract and more concrete. Mm-hmm. And so what I started doing was I started rewriting paragraphs in the voices of my favorite fiction authors, which was such a fun experiment. So how would Stephen King write this paragraph?
Oh, right. Okay.
How would Maggie Smith, an amazing poet, how would she write these sentences? Mm. And that made it a creative exercise again.
As I was doing my research ahead of this conversation, I was watching your TED Talk. And one of the things that really stood out to me in your TED Talk was where you start talking about internet browsers. I immediately checked which browser I was using, and I was using Google Chrome.
There you go.
But you make the case that you can tell someone's, I guess, creativity. I'm paraphrasing, I'm putting words in your mouth here, by which internet browser they use. And there was a really important message in there for me. So can you tell me about that? Exactly what the findings can tell us.
Yeah, I was sitting at a conference that I'd helped to organize, and this researcher, Michael Hausman, is giving a presentation. He's got data from 50,000 people, and he knows they're filling out a survey, and then he's tracking their job performance. Huge range of jobs, and he knows what web browser they're on. It's one of the automatically collected data points. And he's like, I wonder if there's anything there. And he finds that he can predict your job performance and also your likelihood of staying in your job from which web browser you're using. And this was so weird. And he stood up and he said that I don't know what's going on here, but it turns out that Chrome and Firefox users are on average better performers and they stick around longer than if you're using Safari or Internet Explorer. And immediately I had a hunch. I'd been studying initiative and proactivity and being an original thinker. And what hit me was Internet Explorer and Safari are the defaults. They came pre-installed on your phone or your computer. In order to get Chrome or Firefox, you had to question the default and say, I wonder if there's a better browser, and take a little bit of initiative. And so I start proposing this, and people are like, great. So if I download a better browser, I'm going to be better at my job. No, it's not about the browser. It's about the resourcefulness to say you want to be the kind of person who questions the default and asks if there's a better way. And I think what happens is in people's jobs, I've gone on to study this with some colleagues, the kind of person who upgrades their browser is also the kind of person who asks, is there a more creative way to do my job? Can I reinvent the way that we work together? And that ultimately not only makes you better at your job, it also helps you create a job that you want to stay in.
It makes sense. And so on an ongoing basis, I'm only going to hire people who have Mozilla Firefox or Chrome installed in their browser. It should be an interview question.
I don't know if I would go that far.
No, you said it, so I'm going to do it.
I think it's a fun question to say, okay, how did you, let's not limit it to the browser, but talk to me about how you've challenged the status quo in the past.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Perfectionism is a topic people talk about a lot. And I think it seems to me that everybody wants to be considered a perfectionist, as if being a perfectionist is better. Because what does that say about my values? It means that I really care about things being great. It therefore means, by way of that I think I produce great things. And saying you're a perfectionist is almost like saying I make great work. But you're saying that there are often times where it's better to be an imperfectionist. That the judgment of knowing when something is good enough.
Matters. Yeah, I think you're onto something here. So, when you have to answer that annoying job interview question, what's your greatest weakness? It's everyone's favorite answer. I'm too much of a perfectionist. It's like Michael Scott from The American Office. Like, I have weaknesses as a leader. I work too hard and I care too much. And yeah, people do think that perfectionism is, ultimately more of an asset than a liability. And that's why they try to get away with that in the weakness question. But the evidence tells a really different story. Research led by Tom Curran here in the UK shows that perfectionism is not all it's cracked up to be. It's a risk factor for burnout. It also, if you look at the best evidence available, perfectionists do get better grades in school, but they don't actually perform any better in their jobs.
Why?
I think the jury's still out, but my hunch based on the evidence that's been gathered so far is that perfectionists are good at school because they know exactly what's going to be on the test. And so they can cram and memorize until they're prepared to ace the material. The real world is much more ambiguous. You don't know exactly what's going to show up in your performance review. It's not entirely clear what work is going to be valued. And perfectionists are terrified of failure. They don't want any flaws. They don't want any defects. They want to avoid every mistake. And so they don't take enough risks. They focus very narrowly on the things they know they can excel at, and they don't end up growing and evolving and improving enough.
I want to talk to you as well about something you mentioned earlier, which was this idea of doing difficult things. You mentioned it in passing, and the question that was stored in my brain is, what is it that makes a certain type of person choose and lean into difficulty, and a certain type of person lean out of it? Because that appears to be one of the key sort of correlating factors with success in life, your ability to choose discomfort.
Yeah. I think this is such a vital skill. And I want to be really clear to say it's a skill, right? It's not just a personality trait. Some people are born with a little extra, maybe you could say reserve of willpower, or they have the discipline or the grit or the resilience. And it comes naturally to them. But this is very much a learned skill. And I think the clearest demonstration of this for me is in the marshmallow test, which has been wildly misunderstood in the last few years. So you're familiar probably with the classic demonstration that Walter Mischel did with his colleagues, where you take 4-year-olds, you put a marshmallow in front of them, and you say you can have one now, But if you're willing to wait until I come back, then you can have 2. And then the original finding is that if the longer you can delay gratification, if a kid can wait 10 or 15 minutes for the extra marshmallow, the better they score on a standardized test like the SAT. A decade later, the better grades they get in school. There are all kinds of benefits of this delay gratification skill. Well, in psychology recently, there's been a controversy about whether it replicates. And some of the replications have shown that if you have lower socioeconomic status, you struggle with the marshmallow test. It's really disappointing, but it's not at all surprising. And in fact, that was part of the original research, is if you grew up in a world of scarcity, and I know you can relate to this from your own lived experience, you could not afford to wait for the second marshmallow. It might never come. You didn't know if you could trust the research team to come in and bring you one. And so you didn't have the chance to practice that skill and learn the habit. But what's really interesting is if you watch kids who crush the marshmallow test, it's more skill power than willpower. What they have are simple strategies that actually make the temptation less tempting. So you see one kid will actually sits on his hands so that it's a little slower for him to reach out to the marshmallow. Another covers her eyes so she doesn't have to look at it. And then there's one kid who actually smushes it into a ball and starts bouncing it. So like, you don't want to eat that anymore. And this is why I say it's a set of skills, not just a matter of will, because if you have techniques for making discomfort less uncomfortable, and you know how to get it, I guess if you know how to get comfortable being uncomfortable, then you are willing to go into many situations where you're a little bit out of your depth and say, yeah, this might be awkward, this might be embarrassing, but I'm going to learn something. And I guess, for me, that was public speaking. Like you touched on giving TED Talks earlier. I would have never dreamed of standing in a red circle. I had no business whatsoever giving a TED Talk. I'm an introvert. I'm extremely shy. I was terrified of public speaking. And in one of my first lectures, a student wrote in feedback afterward that I was so nervous, I was causing them to physically shake in their seats. And the only way for me to get over that was to put myself continually in that situation and get used to the discomfort.
Is that really the key here? Because I'm thinking as you're speaking about the people who I look up to, like even like a David Goggins, who just seem to be able to hold themselves in discomfort more than anybody else. I mean, a friend of mine called Russ is running the entire length of Africa at the moment, from the bottom to the top of Africa. He's running it. He's doing like 2 marathons a day, most days. And I'm thinking, are these people just like superhumans that were born with this switch in their brain that I can only turn on if I have some kind of traumatic incident? Or does the evidence support the fact that this is a learned skill?
I think everything that matters in life is always a complex interaction of nature and nurture. But I think we underestimate the power of nurture in these situations. So Goggins is a great example. I mean, he's a machine. Was he always that way? No. His whole story is about feeling like he was vulnerable and wanting to become somebody where no one could hurt him, right? And I think when psychologists study that, my favorite theory is probably called the theory of learned industriousness, which is a mouthful. But what it's about is the idea that if you reward effort, if you reward hard work, if you reward seeking out discomfort, then over time, being in uncomfortable situations starts to take on secondary reward properties. In other words, you get a little bit of Pavlovian conditioning where when you've pushed yourself a little bit past where you're comfortable, that feels good. And you're used to that leading to something positive. And that can become sort of a self-reinforcing cycle.
Risk-taking. It is often believed that risk-taking is a key factor in what makes entrepreneurs successful in their life. But your research and your work in Originals in chapter 1, page 17, kind of starts to debunk that myth in I think a really liberating way.
This is good news for me as somebody who's not a big risk taker. It turns out that risk takers are more likely to become entrepreneurs, but the most successful entrepreneurs don't love risk. They take cautious risks, and they're constantly trying to figure out how to reduce the downside and increase the upside. I guess this goes in 2 directions. One direction is to say, if you never take a risk, that's actually a risky way to live your life. It's like building a stock portfolio where you only invest in safe, predictable mutual funds. No, you need a balanced portfolio. You're actually safer if you have some risky investments and some more cautious investments. And I think life is like that too. I think on the other side of that, though, you don't want to just be throwing caution to the wind and making a bunch of dumb bets. What you want to do is you want to figure out what's the probability of this unproven idea succeeding, and then do whatever you can to raise those odds.
Interesting. Because that's not the story we hear in the movies and in the, and I guess that's part because we want to frame ourselves as heroes when we tell our own story. And so framing oneself as a hero involves showing a huge, courageous risk you took. Whereas really, you're saying if you zoom in, you'll see how the best entrepreneurs protected their downside of that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's critical. So let's go back to Elon as an example. I had dinner with him a few years ago, sort of interested in what can we learn from what's worked for him, and then also what hasn't. And I was talking to him about risk taking, and he was talking a lot about wanting to put the first humans on Mars. And I said, how could you possibly be willing to gamble on that? It seems so unlikely. And he said, well, when I first started, I knew it was extremely low probability. And so that wasn't the original mission for SpaceX. The mission was, I want to build a reusable rocket. And that's much more realistic. And I can get people on board with that. And I can get a government contract to do that. And I said, okay, quantify this for me. Like, what are the odds that you're going to make it to Mars in your lifetime? And he said, well, a couple of years ago, I would have said, I don't know, 7-8%. I'm like, and you're doing this despite that? And he said, well, no, the probability's gone way up since then. I'm like, okay, tell me more. And he said, I'd probably say 11% chance now. This is firing you up? He's like, come on, that's double digits. Like we're close to reality. But I think that calculus of saying, I've got to know that this is unrealistic, and I've got to have a side bet, which is something that can build me a viable company. And reusable rockets are what did it. That's what made SpaceX work. It's not the mission, the moonshot, or actually it's a Mars shot. That's not what ultimately allowed them to do what they do now.
Is that in part on his behalf a bit of a framing thing to, as you said, get people on board? Because I think about Neuralink in the same way. When he first started talking about Neuralink, it was all about interfacing with AI and the AI is coming and we need a way to be able to interface with it because it's going to be so much smarter than us that we basically need to become these cyborgs. And in more recent times, he's focused on the ability to give people who have lost access to their limbs, the use of their limbs back. And I was thinking about the transition there he's done in messaging. The latter, this idea of helping people who are disabled regain their ability, seems to be an idea that people will get on board with and will fund. The other idea of interfacing with AI and us becoming cyborgs doesn't appear to me like something people would get behind and fund.
No, they either don't get it or they don't want it.
Yeah, exactly.
Not for me. This is a common challenge for original thinkers. Is sometimes their bold visions are just not palatable to other people. And there's a term that I love that Deborah Meyerson and Maureen Scully coined. They talk about being a tempered radical, which I think is a great phrase to say, take your big extreme idea and try to moderate it to make it a little bit more familiar and a little bit closer to what other people think is plausible and desirable. And then if you do that successfully, you can smuggle your vision inside a Trojan horse.
And that's all about bringing them with you. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Adam, thank you.
Thank you. This has been a joy and an honor.
Appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Right back at you.
In Adam Grant's book Originals, he defines originals as individuals who question traditional ways and take initiative to create better alternatives. He emphasizes that it's not just about having new ideas, but executing them effectively. Personal stories highlight missed opportunities in social networking, underscoring the importance of action. He discusses successful executors, noting that many creative people procrastinate, allowing ideas to incubate and improve. A study showed moderate procrastination boosts creativity by letting ideas develop. Procrastination isn't laziness, but often avoidance of negative emotions linked to challenging tasks. A study on web browsers revealed that users of Chrome and Firefox perform better at work than those using default browsers like Internet Explorer. This suggests that questioning defaults and seeking better options reflect a broader tendency to challenge norms and improve processes. In summary, being original means questioning norms, taking initiative, embracing procrastination for creativity, and continuously seeking improvements. Perfectionism is often seen as a positive trait, suggesting high standards and quality work. Many people proudly label themselves perfectionists, believing it reflects their commitment to excellence. However, research, particularly by Tom Curran in the UK, shows that perfectionism can be detrimental. It is a risk factor for burnout, and while perfectionists may achieve better grades in school, this doesn't translate to better job performance. In school, perfectionists excel because they can predict and prepare for tests. In contrast, the real world is unpredictable, and perfectionists' fear of failure and mistakes limits their willingness to take risks. This narrow focus on areas of guaranteed success hinders their growth and improvement. Consequently, being an imperfectionist who knows when something is good enough can often be more advantageous.
The ability to embrace difficulty is a key factor in achieving success, and it is more of a learned skill than a natural trait. While some individuals might naturally possess more willpower, anyone can develop the skill to choose discomfort. This is exemplified in the marshmallow test, where children who use strategies to delay gratification perform better in the long run. These strategies show that managing temptation and discomfort is about skill, not just willpower. People who excel in challenging situations often have techniques to make discomfort manageable. For example, individuals like David Goggins and others who thrive in difficult circumstances likely develop their resilience through practice and reward for hard work and effort. This learned industriousness suggests that by consistently rewarding effort and the pursuit of discomfort, people can condition themselves to find satisfaction and growth in challenging situations. This approach enables them to push beyond their comfort zones and continually improve. In his book, Chapter 1 debunks the myth that successful entrepreneurs are extreme risk takers. While risk takers are more likely to become entrepreneurs, the most successful ones take calculated risks and work to minimize downsides while maximizing upsides. Living without taking any risks can be just as risky as taking too many. Instead, a balanced approach is best, akin to a diversified investment portfolio. Elon Musk exemplifies this by starting SpaceX with a realistic goal of building reusable rockets rather than immediately aiming to colonize Mars. This cautious approach allowed him to secure government contracts and build a viable company. Musk's strategy involves framing ambitious goals in a more realistic and achievable light to gain support and reduce perceived risks. This is similar to how he adjusted the focus of Neuralink from interfacing with AI to helping people with disabilities, making the concept more relatable and fundable. The idea is to be a tempered radical, moderating bold visions to make them more acceptable and feasible to others, thus smuggling radical ideas within a more familiar framework.